What's up, everybody? You are listening to the Credentials Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sterenberg, and we've got another phenomenal episode for you today. We're talking with Jason Weaver, VP of Product at Instructure. We're talking about the next 5 years of digital credentialing. You might be thinking to yourself, the VP of Instructure on this podcast, are they just going to try to sell me something? No, we're not going to do that. This is a thought leadership podcast. We're talking about where digital credentialing needs to go, what our perspective on it is, and I think you're going to learn a lot. We handle the skills and competencies. How do we make these micro-credentials and badges part of the official academic record? How do we even start to think about that? So really good conversation. Jason's a really smart guy and has been in this world for a long time, so I think he's got a really good perspective on where digital credentialing can and should go in the future. So without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Jason. Here we go. All right, Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Matt, good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So just in case anybody is concerned, we're not plugging product on this podcast. This is talking about the next 5 years of digital credentialing, and we're recording this live at the One EdTech Digital Credentials Summit. And you just talked about, in part, where Instructure wants to go, but also broadly where you think digital credentialing should go. So we're going to touch on a few of those themes, but I do want you to talk a little bit about your background. Like, you've been in digital credentialing a long time. You've seen a lot change.
Yeah, we've been at this for a long time, you and I together. So I started in digital credentialing 15 years ago when I joined a company called DocuFide, which was really focused on the idea of helping high schools go through digital transformation around transcript exchange. And so DocuFide became Parchment just a little bit after I joined under the leadership of our CEO, Dr. Patinsky. And we went on a journey to think about how to extend the kinds of credentials that we support to be more than just about transcripts, to be about all the different forms and functions that credentials serve. And we expanded to think not just about the high school learner's journey, but to think about lifelong learning and the different pathways that learners explore with their credentials to have outcomes in education and in the workforce. And so over the last 15 years, I've had the opportunity to do lots of different things, work with many different institutions on evolving their digital credential strategy. That ultimately led to my transition into product leadership. And so I have led a team of product and technologists here at the organization for probably 7 or 8 years, and really excited now that we're about a year in to that journey with Instructure, being a part of Instructure since last year. And we all couldn't be happier. There's such a tremendous opportunity for us to extend the kind of issue and manage of mint of credentials that Parchment had traditionally focused on with the broader set of data in the Instructure ecosystem that comes both from Canvas, the learning and teaching and learning environment, as well as from Mastery, which is our set of tools for K-12 assessment. And so between those three product families within Instructure, we're in a really interesting position to be able to continue to invest to give credentials more meaning based on all the things that our technology ecosystem helps observe.
So when you think about the next 5 years of digital credentialing, credentials could mean anything, as you highlighted. It could be a transcript, it could be a diploma. But when we think about the next 5 years of digital credentialing, it seems like, in some ways, the transcript used to be paper, largely digital today. Maybe we want to send it more as data. That's a whole big discussion. But a lot of this is around micro-credentials, badges, what people have called alternative credentials. One of your points of emphasis, one thing you highlighted in your presentation today was how they can join the official academic record. Why do you think that's critical?
Yeah, it's something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And as we kind of watch institutions go on a journey of digital transformation with their traditional credentials, institutions were kind of in a separate lane thinking about how do I adopt micro-credentials and digital badges. And the idea that digital credentials of those forms can help learners assert their skills in a way that's meaningful to workforce is, I think, one of the big opportunities that orienting our teaching and learning to skills and assessment of those skills in terms of awarding digital credentials is really important. But one of the things that we see the registrar community within institutions thinking about is, what are these new forms of credentials? These aren't things that exist on the transcript, and the transcript is our official academic record. And so we have heard a lot from that community about the trying to go through the process of rethinking how to organize their data and how to represent that data, because registrars ultimately are kind of the most responsible people at the institution to verify the accuracy of a learner's complete record. And as that record starts to include more digital badges, thinking about them as something separate from the traditional academic transcript just creates a lot of kind of workflow questions. And learners, we can foresee, in a few years, learners want to be able to verify something. Maybe they've lost digital access to it. So they're going to reach out to the registrar and say, hey, I attended this professional development course. How do I get a copy of that record to show that I've learned those skills? So we've really thought about what is the container that gets represented in. The digital badge it is itself a portable container, but it's not one that's well recognized by verifiers yet. Whereas the traditional academic transcript is something that's very well recognized and used very consistently to verify education. So we think about a future where digital badges can exist as those little portable containers of skills verification. But is there a way to either extend the traditional academic transcript or think about a new type of academic record that's a little bit more holistic and inclusive so that we can extend beyond what are just kind of courses and grades, degree awards of the traditional academic transcript into something that both helps learners capture the holistic earnings of their academic experience, and then to be able to reflect on that and use it with employers to serve as part of the official record of the institution. So maybe more strongly represented than just a badge itself, and more inclusively represented than the traditional academic transcript is. And we think that having space for that new kind of record is something that will really help learners take those kind of extended digital credentials and access opportunities that rely on them.
I think the other thing is like economy of information too. Like if I could have how many badges if this continues to grow and institutions really embrace it. I have 20 badges and I'm looking at an opportunity. It's like, here's 20 individual badges. And so like,
right.
How do we represent this visually? How do we make this easy on the consumption end? Because that's still the big topic at the Digital Credentials Summit, which is like, okay, how does this meaningfully create opportunities? Like as we think about this in the future, how do we connect to employment? And I think the answer for a lot of the workforce is going to be like, give me the information that I need or give it to me in a way that I can understand it really easily rather than like 20 different badges that you're just bombing me with.
And I think there's huge opportunity when we think about both kind of the technical standard of CLR, which is kind of philosophically designed to be a container, the broader idea of a learning and employment record, an LER, as a place where those could go. And I think there's an evolution towards greater adoption of those standards over time. And at the same time, we want to make sure that institutions and learners are empowered now in the ways that verifiers are looking to verify those academic records now. And so I think there's an important responsibility that we have to participate in the standards and align with the standards, adopt the standards, and also to look for ways that are more in reach for institutions with where their technology sits today.
I think this is a good segue into another key point you made, and one of the focuses of Instructure and where we think we want to go in the ecosystem broadly, but it's thinking about these micro-credentials, these badges, and just the quote-unquote alternative credentials, thinking about them as being better valued for credit. And so part of it, I think if you put it on some official record, it gives you some ability to do that. Tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking there.
Yeah, I think, as I said, the big vision of digital credentials is really about aligning learning experiences with assessment of skills to validate for employers that a learner is ready for whatever workforce opportunity they have. That's been one of the big promises, and I think where we're moving as a sector towards a kind of skills orientation, skills-based hiring. But one of the things that we've seen been emerging over the last several years are there are many providers in the space like Google, like edX, like Coursera, who are delivering very meaningful content in ways that are more accessible to learners and outside of traditional education. They are certifying those learners through badges, through micro-credentials, and more institutions are starting to think about what recognizing those learning experiences and that assessment means for bringing students into traditional programs, and whether those are short form, kind of stacked micro-credentials, or whether they are more traditional transfer student, non-traditional undergraduate education programs. There are more and more sources today of learning that can be recognized for credit for prior learning or recognition for prior learning. Being able to take those kinds of credentials and turn them into something that the institutions who have very refined processes for credit evaluation, for prior learning assessment, like the form of a transcript, is something that I think institutions are really looking for as they start to think about how to scale their credit for prior learning. And so just as your example, it'd be really hard to expect a learner to kind of go and individually curate and export the 20 badges that they earned that represent a decent part of education that they want credit for as they transition into new programs. And I think digital credentialing is a great strategy to achieve that ultimately, if we think about kind of the workflows and the processes that are associated with how institutions work, and ultimately what is convenient and accessible for learners to do with the records that they own.
And I've said this on probably several episodes, but I think it's also like the pathway to credit is incredibly important because we think of, because of the cost of higher ed and a number of other factors, the pressure on higher ed, it feels like it becomes, we have this transactional view of what job does this get me with this credential? And it's like the next job, but we have to think about it more holistically of, I might want that job for a few years, but ultimately we still believe that there's value in a degree, whether it's an associate's or bachelor's or whatever. And so, yes, we can get you your next job, maybe in the form of a short-term credential, but we still want you to be on a path to a degree, because you might say, I want to get into management. I need to learn more accounting, like your associate's degree matters. And if we start to feed this in, and then from an enrollment perspective, I think it's incredibly valuable to unlock this more adult learners, right? And then it gives more value to these credentials. I'm not just getting this credential, I'm getting credit for what I'm earning. And I think that has a lot of power.
I think all of us have been inspired by this vision of the future where credit is really currency. And the challenge that we have today is the value of credit that I've earned as a learner is very opaque. It's very locked up. And it's very, to use the same word, it's very transactional with whichever institution you might think is the right next place for you. I think we all imagine a world where we've been able to evolve the technology to a point where credit is more transparently understood. The value of the credit a learner has is more transparent for them and gives them greater agency in being able to explore which programs at which institutions are best optimized for whatever it is that they are pursuing, right? Is it time to degree? Is it cost to completion? Is it specific kind of program expertise that an institution has? And there are a lot of fundamental things that we're doing, I think, in the ecosystem over the next several years that help to continue to build towards that. But completely agree that thinking about micro-credentials as a strategy to let learners mark paid part of the credit that they've earned, either in those educational contexts. ACE does a tremendous amount of work on the transferability of prior learning experiences. And I think there are lots of good strategies that we can put in place from a technology point of view that help facilitate that.
So I think what is necessary is thinking about the skills and competencies that are embedded within all these credentials if you're going to transfer it, right? And so how do you see the connection to skills frameworks?
Yeah, when we think about digital credentials, it is really meaningful to empower institutions, faculty to be able to provide recognition, right? To provide some incentive to learners to be able to continue and pursue the educational programs they're a part of. But you could skeptically say, a badge is just a pretty picture. unless I understand what it represents, not at a very superficial level, but at that deep level that helps communicate my skills or abilities that I gained as a part of that academic experience. And so really looking for ways for us to be thoughtful to help institutions as they're going on their digital credentialing evolution journey to be able to create credentials that have deeper and deeper sets of meaning through the alignment of those digital credentials with skills and taxonomies, so that as we build this ecosystem of millions and hundreds of millions of digital credentials of different sizes, that those are anchored back to things that we can understand in terms of a deeper meaning about what a student learned, what it means relative to a particular knowledge domain, and how to think about the leveling of a learner's experience in those specific areas inside that domain.
This is something that we didn't talk about before, but it is, I think, a challenge with badging where, and you brought this up in your session, which I thought was interesting, like we need better visual consistency or a visual language around these badges. And what made me think of that is, a badge can often feel binary, badged or unbadged, which is totally different than what we're used to, where it's like, I got 4 credit hours, I got a C in Latin American history. And we don't actually have a very good way of communicating. What does a C mean? And how much, were you great at the writing portion? Couldn't do that. But we do also, the same challenge exists with badges. You get a badge, but here's the skills frame. How much did you take in, right? We don't want it to be just, I passed the course. And so the idea of visual representations of these things was, have I displayed knowledge? Was I just participating? I do think that is important as we think about connecting to these skills frameworks, for it to be trusted by people, for it not to just be, all right, you must have earned every single skill that you were intended to earn with this badge. There's got to be some way to communicate exactly what it means.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because I think we as a community have a lot of work to do, because even we kind of argue about the semantics. Is this a badge? Is it a micro-credential? What's the difference? And so, when you start to expand that into kind of levels of mastery that might be represented, those of us who really enjoy nerding out on the details of how all this works will take it in, but we have to zoom out to, what do learners who are not so deeply embedded in what does all this mean, the nuance of the meaning, right? And to think that workforce is going to learn that nuance, I think is a little bit far-fetched, right? So it's on us as a community and us as a technology in the ecosystem to really think about, how do we simplify that? How do we simplify making those decisions for institutions? How do we represent it clearly to learners? How do we make sure that verifiers understand? So there's definitely a lot for us to think about in terms of how do we organize and how do we help align to the governance models that institutions have already started to adopt, and how do we think about that evolving over time?
So as we think about the next 5 years, it's going to be important to have automation, workflows, and then to think about this at scale. We're sitting in a lot of sessions here, and it's a lot of what we're learning is the hard work that it's taking to stand up some of these micro-credential programs, and everyone's learning from each other, and it's great. But if we really want this to get bigger and for it to be getting the scale and to involve workforce, we have to be sending a lot of these, and learners have to adopt it. Can you share a little bit more about what you're thinking with workflows, automation for institutions, and then how we scale this for learners?
Yeah, I think that's really key. We have to think about, as I said, from a community point of view, we have to kind of think about how we're going to organize. And we want to move beyond kind of the trailblazing that's happened over the last many years, right, around digital credentialing, because this is not something we just started, right? This has been going on for years. And as I think about institutions trying to build programs that are sustainable, that are scalable, that help them attract and retain learners and enrollments, it really comes down to a couple of areas where right now there are workflows happening that institutions are kind of building themselves, right? There's internal governance, faculty review, kind of internal committees around making sure that the micro-credentials that are being created by within the institution are aligning to the frameworks and the goals that those institutions have for those micro-credentials. But today, that's something that's happening through conversations, through spreadsheets and emails. If you think about rolling out a large-scale digital credentialing program at your institution, that's probably not the system that you want to adopt to be able to manage and maintain that over years in the future. So kind of thinking about workflows and the process and governance from an institutionally inward point of view, I think is an area where we see lots of opportunity to help. There is also then kind of the secondary review that may need to happen. So One EdTech has been working over probably about the last 2 years on the idea of trusted credential program, which says, how can we as One EdTech go out and provide a little bit of an assurance about the quality of this badge? And institutions that wish to create these trusted credentials have kind of a rubric that they need to meet in terms of the minimum data. But ultimately, that's something that has to be validated and approved by an external party, and in this case, One EdTech. And so thinking about both the workflows that credential development needs to take inside the institution and how that might extend to different verifying and quality assurance type organizations is another area where we think that we need better tooling. And then when you think about the journey that we've been on with institutions, and I know this is true kind of across those institutions who've been leading the trail around either comprehensive learner records or LERs, whichever terminology you want to use, it is that one of the first and biggest challenges they face is the data that they want to represent in those comprehensive records sits in many disconnected systems around campus. And there are not yet today the tooling inside the different systems where you want to be able to access that data as an institution to articulate it for learners to be able to connect all of the dots. And so when we think about kind of the frontiers around automation, it's not only thinking about what are the best ways to ensure that digital badging can issue quickly. And we've long solved the challenge of being able to automate transcripts as a credential, but being able to aggregate and automate data across these disparate sources to be able to really form that cohesive record for learners is an area where I think there's a lot of opportunity to work through and across the education technology community to start to build that interoperability and connectivity.
And then on the learner side, I was sitting in a few sessions and a few people asked great questions like the containers of these credentials, I think is a really interesting question. Obviously, you and I have a point of view. We work for Instructure and we have a learner profile, like when you log onto your account and you can see your high school transcript, your college transcript, your college diploma, and other credentials within that. But I think there are, how do we think about this? Because everyone wants to be like, what's this one central digital wallet, which is just a challenge. Like, how do we start to think about it from the Instructure point of view, but then also, what do you think is realistic as providers work together so that someone doesn't use Parchment or Canvas credentials or whatever? Like, how do we what's realistic in your mind?
Yeah, I think the ideas of wallets and self-sovereignty has been one that's very interesting and it's empowering. I think it becomes problematic when we think about what is the typical learner as a consumer willing to do, what are they able to do from kind of a contextual understanding point of view. I don't know about you. I only have one wallet and it's not the wallet that my credit card issuer gave to me, right? It's the one that I picked. And so that's if I step away from not looking at this through an Instructure lens, but just looking at what is best for learners and what do we think that they are willing and able to do.
It's not a technology problem. It's a human problem.
I do think the idea of multiple wallets and a variety of wallets is a little bit more of a people problem than it is a technology problem because there are lots of great folks who are innovating around the technology and the technical concept of a wallet I don't think is a hard one. When we think about this, from our experience as Instructure, we have really found that at scale across tens of millions of learners are really looking for simplicity. They're looking for the ability to take the action that they want with the ability to ask the questions that they need to ask when things don't go as they expected. And they are thinking kind of across their academic experience. So what Parchment brought to Instructure is kind of a technology philosophy that is a little bit different from Canvas, which is the anchor of Instructure. Canvas is something that happens for you as a learner only at your institution. And you may attend multiple institutions that all use Canvas, but you're not taking a journey across those institutions in Canvas. You're learning the courses of the institution that you attended. Parchment's orientation is between institutions, right? Parchment is the set of tools that learners use to move from one institution to another, to kind of go back in time and access the different parts of their academic experience. And we have seen learners be very willing to kind of adopt that learner portal as the place where they can come back over time and kind of have that longitudinal access to their information. I think there's lots of opportunity for us to continue to think about the role open standards play in being able to your kind of question, to not just make that about the Parchment network, but to think about how can we bring in other sources of credentials, other issuing sources into that infrastructure. And we are very involved with the conversations around how to establish the technical trust to be able to do that at scale. Ultimately, it's our obligation to institutions and to learners to make sure that we are trusted in the exchange of their credentials. And so we have to be really sure that as we engage in those things, that we're not introducing any ability for there to be a risk or question about the veracity of credentials that we're exchanging and facilitating.
Yeah, we shouldn't pursue one, like, what's the one wallet that's going to win out? It's like, no, like, we have Android, we have Apple. It's like, it's mildly inconvenient at times, but we can talk and text to each other. It works. There's communication. So you're an Android guy, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm a green bubble.
Yeah, you're making everybody. Yeah. But it still works. It's interoperable. Like, we have to find ways to communicate, and that way it's a mild inconvenience. If I'm a student, I have to log into 2 different places, but at least if there's a way to share information across from each other.
Yeah, the trust. There are definitely ways to ensure the trust, and the standards are facilitating that. And there's more to do in that area over time.
Jason, is there anything we didn't cover or anything you'd like to highlight?
Wow, I feel like we've covered so many things. You know, it's so exciting, I think, for us both to be a part now of kind of this bigger ecosystem of the data that's powering education. And so I think just really excited about how we can take some of these ideas and bring them into practice so that institutions can continue to evolve, ultimately in support of making it easier for learners to access their credentials and to turn those into opportunities.
Appreciate you joining me.
Thanks, Matt.
So that is our episode. Thanks again to Jason Weaver for joining me. I've known Jason a long time and always appreciate his perspective. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed what you heard today. We've got some more great episodes coming up. We're going to be speaking with Marla Gunasagaram from the California State University System Office, and she's going to be talking to us about how they have implemented digital badging, both for professional development and for their students. So some great episodes coming up. But yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to y'all real soon. Goodbye.